this was a controversial thing and a very, very painful one because, the civilians were killed. The attitude of the West has always been, well, look at what you did in Kosovo leading up to this. And which is, of course, that should be discussed. And there were very horrible things happening in Kosovo, and nobody, I think, should ever deny that. But at the same time, we've come to this point where NATO is not subjected. The US and NATO are kind of above the law.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. As the war in Ukraine grinds on, so does a geopolitical reshuffling of European countries blindly following America off of a cliff. The crisis of Western capitalism led to the election of Nazis in Sweden, while the drive for escalation with Russia prompted Finland and Sweden to join NATO, placing themselves on the front lines of a war in which they have nothing to gain. But while it may appear that NATO is still all about countering Russia, the US is in the process of reconfiguring NATO into an anti-China military alliance, which would cause even more economic devastation to the EU. Yet some of the only hesitation for this Cold War insanity is coming from a certain Balkan state. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by writer and journalist Lily Lynch. But before we jump into it, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can help it grow by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news or by donating below on YouTube. Lily, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rania.
It's so good to have you on. I've been loving, I've been harassing you to come on because you're writing these great pieces for New Left Review. And we're going to talk about a few of them. I'll link to them all in the description. But I guess let's maybe go in backwards order here for the most recent, which you recently wrote about Sweden, where some Nazis happened to win an election, or neo-Nazis. I don't know. You can clarify exactly what the deal is. So there's this party, right? It's the Sweden Democrats. It has roots in the neo-Nazi movement, from what I understand. They won in these recent elections. So why don't we start out with, who is this party? What's their ideology? And why is their victory so significant?
Okay, so the Sweden Democrats actually came in second in the most recent Swedish election. The Social Democrats won about 30% of the vote. Sweden Democrats won about 20% of the vote. Ugh. So, and the Sweden Democrats have a pretty kind of classically extreme or far right ideology. They are, anti-immigrant. They're critical of the EU. They don't like globalization. They're nationalists. They want the Swedish welfare state to serve Swedish people. They are very kind of nostalgic for this sort of Sweden of the mid-20th century social democracy. So this is by far the most power they've ever had. Now the second biggest right-wing party, which is kind of a more conventional right-wing party. They're kind of center-right, called the Moderate Party. That's Carl Bildt's party. Their leader is prime minister, and he was tasked with forming the government. And so Sweden Democrats actually aren't going to be in the government, but they're providing support from the outside. It's kind of a unique arrangement. And so they still will have a lot of power, a lot of sway, because they are the second most powerful party in Sweden, and their agenda is going to get is going to be met probably more than ever before. And it's also kind of a victory for the right in the sense that, the more mainstream parties have moved towards the right. So the Moderate Party has adopted some of their rhetoric on immigration, and so has the Social Democrats, actually. The recently resigned prime minister said that blamed a lot of the kind of crime that has been happening in Sweden on failure to integrate. So this is sort of a victory for the right, but I'd also say that it's also a victory for kind of the status quo. Because what you see happening with the Sweden Democrats, you see elsewhere in Europe, which is with the far right, that some of their rhetoric is adopted by the mainstream, but at the same time, then the far right also adopts some more kind of mainstream right-wing economic policies. So Whereas in the past, you would have heard a lot of like welfare chauvinism, like glorifying this welfare state. Now they've introduced kind of more Thatcherite economic kind of liberalism into their program.
Yeah, and that's a really good point too, because the other thing about this party, which didn't, it had this kind of sort of whatever second place victory, but it was a big deal. And the mainstream media in the West didn't seem to care so much. And I think a part of that may have been because even if they claim to be like anti-EU, are they really? Because they're also not anti-NATO.
Right, right. I mean, they will kind of use a lot of this anti-globalism rhetoric, but they're very, very openly pro-NATO now. There's a moment a few years ago in Parliament where there was going to be a vote on whether or not to allow NATO troops to be on Swedish soil, something like that, some level of cooperation with NATO. Of course, Sweden was previously a neutral country until this year, or officially neutral. They've been cooperating with NATO for a very long time. But in this vote, at the last minute, the Sweden Democrats changed their mind and they kind of ended up voting in favor of an increased cooperation with NATO. They've certainly kind of been still kind of touting this anti-globalist line, but now definitely have embraced NATO. And even in the last couple of weeks, you've seen a sort of a lot of the sort of like human rights rhetoric that was coming out of the Social Democrats government is kind of lost now when it comes to NATO. Now it's just very, very much like, we'll accept Erdogan's demand that we, send Kurdish activists to back to Turkey, because Erdogan was blocking Sweden's accession to NATO. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think this also says a lot about the Swedish left, which you mentioned in one of your pieces. You actually wrote, indolent and center-left politicians issue limp pleas for tolerance. The Social Democrats have been willingly cannibalized by NATO and financial markets. They fail to rally support. So I'm curious, what has happened to the left in Sweden? Because it seems like at a moment like this, especially around the world, you have this sort of crisis of Western capitalism, and many financial crises that have led to the rise of a far right. And you would think that it would also have some sort of benefit for the far left to make its case, but we really haven't seen that in many places. Quite the opposite. So what do you mean when you say that the left in Sweden has been cannibalized by sort of like the pro-NATO stuff? And yeah, what is left of the left, I guess?
What's happened to the Swedish left? There's a left party. They got about 6% of the vote in this last election, which was less than they had hoped going into the election. But they're increasingly what you see happening with them is what you see happening with a lot of left parties in Europe, which is that increasingly their kind of constituency and most faithful supporters are in like urban, very, very wealthy areas. So this is kind of an urbanization of the left, so to speak. And there's a lot of kind of soul searching after this kind of relatively negative result for them. And obviously the Sweden Democrats' victory, what did we do wrong? And it's something that, we know very well. It's the same kind of questions, like, should we be, stronger identity politics, or more should we be appealing to Sweden Democrat voters or working class kind of Swedes? So there's a lot of those kinds of debates happening that are happening internationally. And of course, the leader of the left party was she really was coming out very strongly in favor of a referendum on NATO membership. But even she has kind of given some interviews where she said that, this is we're entering a different era, and we might need to reassess whether or not, neutrality is going to be the best way. But she has asked for a referendum. Of course, nobody else in like kind of mainstream politics supported that.
Yeah. And then do you see a connection between the victory of the right in Sweden and then a place like Italy? I know that you haven't been covering Italy, but I'm just curious your thoughts on the fact that this is happening in more than one place at this particular moment.
I think it's a very similar pattern in Italy that you see in Sweden, where it's this kind of negotiation between like these. So the mainstream sort of adopting some elements of the far right, and then the far right also kind of adopting some more neoliberal economic policies in order to kind of secure power. So yeah, it seems very, and also in addition to the kind of far right parties adopting a more kind of neoliberal economic policy, also adopting a kind of more pro-NATO policy and kind of getting in line behind like U.S. policies. So that's kind of, they're very similar in that regard. And I think that's probably going to be observed by a lot of far right parties elsewhere in Europe. This is the formula for success. That's going to be something we're going to see elsewhere.
And then I guess this also, this is more of like a theoretical question, I guess, but these parties don't, like you mentioned, they didn't get a majority of the vote, right? They came in second. And even in Italy, it's not like they got a majority, but it's a parliamentary system. Do you think there is a kind of crisis in these parliamentary democracies when you see these far-right movements gaining power in situations where they don't actually have a majority of support?
Is a good question. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, possibly. I mean, I'm not a political scientist, so I don't really look into that kind of thing. It's an interesting question. I would lay more blame here with the kind of centrist parties. The kind of in Sweden they're called bourgeois parties, the liberal and like center right. They call themselves bourgeois parties too. It's really funny. So I think that this willingness of the mainstream politicians to work with the far right, that's where the kind of problem lies. I don't know if it's structural so much.
Yeah, I guess you see that a lot, especially even in the States. You'll see centrist politicians far more willing to work with the right than anybody on the left. That's for sure. But I want to shift gears to a bit of a different, though tangentially related topic, and that's the issue of, and I also want to get to Sweden joining NATO, but we'll get there. But first, you also wrote about the issue of NATO sort of coming for China, because I think most people would probably assume that because of the war in Ukraine, that NATO is not just still about countering Russia, but is actually like double, tripling, quadrupling down on countering Russia, which it is. Mm-hmm. But you wrote this piece called Looking East about how the intention of the Western countries is actually to also reconfigure NATO into this kind of anti-China military alliance on belligerent US-UK lines. I'm just quoting you. So I'm curious if you could expand on that a bit. Why is that? Like, what's going on there and why is that happening?
I would say it's more of a kind of subtle tilt at this point than in like a total reorientation, but it is really significant. NATO released its first sort of like new strategic kind of concept the first time since I think 2010, just this year. Russia's been a threat to the so-called Euro-Atlantic space, been identified as a threat to the Euro-Atlantic space, now for a while. But China was always kind of, was not at least formally or officially identified as such. In this new strategic concept, China is identified as a challenge, systemic challenge. So that's not quite at the level of Russia, which is identified as a threat, but a challenge. And I know that there was a lot of debate within NATO about which words to use to describe China. I know that the US and UK wanted a more kind of stronger language. They wanted perhaps even use the word threat, whereas Germany and France wanted the word downgraded, the challenge. So it is significant. And also, NATO invited the leaders of South Korea and several other Asian countries to their meeting this year for the first time. So this is a kind of glance, this does signify like a subtle kind of shift. So I think it's significant, and I think that it'll be worth watching. 10 or 12, 13 years ago, we could not have imagined that we would be where we are today. Yeah. So we don't know. Who knows where we'll be in 10 years with it.
That's a good point. And particularly when it comes to the EU, I think this is quite significant. And as you note in your piece, you're right. Like, you note that in 2020, China surpassed the US to become the EU's largest trading partner. So then it raises the question, why would the EU commit, or at least some countries in the EU commit to this kind of economic suicide for the US, which is already what they're doing with respect to Russia, but then on top of that with China, their biggest trading partner?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that the invasion of Ukraine has obviously changed a lot of the discussion and has given fueled a lot of the kind of more hawkish positions. The EU has really Joseph Borrell, one of the main kind of like EU figures, wrote a very, very scathing critique of China a couple months ago. He called he kind of blasted their what he called pro-Russia neutrality, which is kind of what you hear leveled at non-aligned countries too. This idea that non-alignment is actually kind of not truly non-alignment, but it's a pro-Russian position now. So I think that it is significant for the EU because China has hoped for a very long time the EU would be a balancing partner against the United States. And so you read Chinese media and you listen to their statements, they frequently stop short of really criticizing the EU as much as they do the US. They see the EU as being sort of sacrificed by the United States. So yes, it is a very like kind of strong shift for them, and we'll see. This is an ongoing discussion. Germany's under a tremendous amount of pressure from all sides from many sides to take a more kind of hawkish line.
And yeah, of course, it's like you said, it's very specific to each country as well. But then, in that sense, which countries in Europe, whether in and out of the EU, still maintain strong relations with China? And then, moreover, like, why would a small country, one like, let's say, Lithuania, take such a strong anti-China position?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that the closest relations you'll see in Europe with China is Serbia and Hungary. Those are the two closest. Serbia, especially, having what they call like a steel or iron friendship with China, and the countries that have kind of opted out more of the relations with China are in the Baltics, and you see this China-led sort of economic development program that was targeted towards like Central and Eastern Europe. Several of the Baltic countries, I think actually all of the Baltic countries have left it now.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And then I'm laughing because you also mentioned, I always laugh when I see the name Peter Thiel, but you also mentioned in your piece the company Palantir, and then of course you mentioned people like Peter Thiel and their involvement in programs like the NATO Innovation Fund that you mentioned, which is all about the sort of reorientation towards China. So why are these people so invested and so dangerous in this regard?
Well, Peter Thiel's kind of philosophy is, using government to become bigger than government, and he's, it's really kind of a funny kind of like innovation on the right, this idea, Palantir has cooperated with the NSA. Their fingerprints are all over kind of all kinds of like mass surveillance programs in the United States and Europe. And of course, that company was like, initially had like very, very has like the CIA built into its origins. It was like I think funded by the CIA or partly at least had a strong cooperation. So this is kind of I don't know a lot about it. I'm not like an expert in this area, but there's certainly it's certainly kind of alarming his reach.
Yeah, especially because of like everything he funds. The guy's money is everywhere. And so and also now to like switch gears to the issue of Finland and Sweden joining NATO. You wrote a really good piece about this. I know it seems maybe like a little dated to bring this up now, but it didn't really get discussed that as much as it should have, the fact that Finland and Sweden joined NATO. And I thought something that you highlighted was very interesting in the sense of the issue of age and class. You read the demographic most opposed to NATO membership in Sweden is young men aged 18 to 29. Support for membership actually rises with each age bracket, with the elderly most staunchly in favor. And then you wrote of Finland that the typical NATO supporter is an educated, middle-aged or older male working in a management level position, earning at least 85,000 euros a year and politically on the right, while the typical NATO skeptic is under the age of 30, a worker or a student earning less than 20,000 euros a year and politically on the left. So can you talk a bit about the correlation of age and class with either support or opposition to NATO membership and why you think that is?
It's a good question. I think that, one really kind of glaring obvious point is that, young men between ages 18 and 29 would be called upon to fight in a war, should Article 5 be triggered or whatever, and a war started. So I think there's the kind of frustration among young men, this idea that their parents lived in this kind of social democracy, had the benefits of social democracy, and the peace that came with neutrality for during the Cold War, and now they're just willing to sacrifice their kids now that they're old and they have their they've gotten theirs, so to speak. And so I think that's a part of it. Also, there's just a long association between, at least in Sweden, which I'm much more familiar with in Finland, with the bourgeois parties in NATO, and a kind of more pro-US position. During the 20th century, at least, the Social Democrats in Sweden had a very they were much more kind of connected to the global South. Olof Palme posed, smoking cigars with Castro. Sweden has an embassy in a consulate in North Korea. They were very sort of supportive of like decolonization efforts, and that was fairly unique in Europe. And so I think that there's a kind of a hangover, the association with the kind of the center left of the left being sort of anti-NATO and pro-neutrality, whereas the right has always been kind of more, pro-militaristic, pro-war, and, aligned with the US.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then you also noted, of course, and this isn't surprising at all, that the strongest or most ardent supporters of NATO membership can be found among Sweden and Finland's business leaders, who I'm sure have a lot of money to make from contracts due to militarization from joining NATO. But in Sweden, also, this wasn't exactly a democratic process. You actually called it a shock doctrine approach. What did you mean by that?
That was how it's described by kind of a lot of the critics. So Sweden historically has held referendums on every major decision like this one. So, for example, the adoption of the euro, EU membership. And so many critics of the way this was carried out pointed to the fact that, this time around, they decided we're not going to hold a referendum. We're just going to, one thing that's really interesting is you'll see people who are proponents of NATO membership for Sweden say, well, look at the polls, like whatever, however many, you have a majority of people support NATO membership, as if imagine, like, what if we carried out elections this way? What if, you can't just say like, okay, look at the polls, like, hey, that's good enough, why hold an election? Like, so it's really like that kind of thing. So yeah, it was shock doctrine in the sense that, people were shocked, when Russia invaded Ukraine. People were, people who were very shocked by it, like most people. What else were we wrong about? Is just this war going to expand? And so, using the sort of architecture that had already been in place in media in Sweden for some time, that pushing for NATO membership. For example, there's like a Swedish like psychological defense agency that was just opened earlier this year, at the very beginning of this year, supposedly to maintain or to like monitor the integrity of elections, specifically this election in September that they just had. This is like a very kind of, I hate to use the word dystopian because it's like overused, but very, very much sounds kind of creepy. Yeah. And so I think that the people who've been pushing for NATO membership for a very long time in Sweden use this as an opportunity to kind of push it through without the debate, the democratic process, the referendum that would have accompanied other that have accompanied other kind of big debates similar in the past.
Yeah. And then you also mentioned the role of the media, and specifically also, I know you said, Sweden better than Finland, but that there was so much less mainstream opposition in Finland. Mm-hmm. But I guess, what was the role of the media in pushing support for NATO membership? I imagine, I don't know the media layout of these places, but if it's anything like the US, I imagine it was pretty significant.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of really interesting research into how the media landscape has changed in Sweden over the over the course of the past, say 20 years or so, with it moving, very, very steadily towards kind of a, like pro, say, right wing, like kind of pro, like neoliberal, the decline of sort of party affiliated newspapers, new ownership. So it's just a very overwhelmingly sort of like big liberal center right media space. And so I think that has probably played a significant role. it would be really interesting to kind of do a study on that, and some of the, there's some really kind of hilarious, I write about it in my piece, but there's some kind of like great, like, newspaper covers that came out of the entire kind of joining NATO debate. In Finland, like the biggest newspaper, one of the biggest newspapers, had this hilarious image that I describe in the article, which is like, these two Vikings rowing towards like a new dawn. It's the sun rising, and then like in the sun is like the NATO symbol, and the NATO like whatever, logo.
That sounds like a Nazi like.
It's very, very weird. It's weird. And they're leaving behind this kind of gray hulking structure with a red star on it. So it's very kind of clear symbolism, right? Like we see what's happening here.
The obsession with Vikings is so weird.
Yeah.
So to also like just, on a related note as well is the issue of like you mentioned earlier, what's his face? Schultz talking about, what did he call it? Neutrality, pro-Russia neutrality, right? Putting it in the
well.
So that brings us to the issue. I mean, one place it's gotten some rhetorical pushback over being seemingly neutral because it refuses to do, to get on board with sanctions is Serbia. So this is actually where your expertise really lies, is with the Balkan countries. Why do Serbia and I guess Bosnian Serbs outside of Serbia as well support Russia, or do they actually support Russia? But for the most part, you get the sense they do. What's that about?
I would say that it's more complex than just, do they support Russia? Do they not support Russia? I think that it's more that they reject the West, or they in part because they feel rejected by the West. And I think that that's, kind of this nominal support for Russia the support for Russia you see among Serbs is a more, it's down to the fact that Russia did not participate in the NATO bombing in 1999. But it kind of is as simple as that. And that's not to say that Russia has, I think that this sort of idea of like Russia-Serbia eternal Orthodox friendship is very much overstated. Mm-hmm. I think that there are, of course, these kind of ardent Putin-philes like in Serbia for sure, but there's a more kind of sense of like, a rejection of the West owing to its like perceived anti-Serbian policies during the 90s, including culminating in the NATO bombing, and also, subsequently the Kosovo's declaration of independence, which was backed by Western countries. So most Western countries. So I think that it kind of the kind of truth of this kind of Serbian-Russian sort of bond is more kind of complex than it seems on the outside. But certainly Serbia has said that it will not impose sanctions. I don't know if that will hold, if they will end up imposing some small sanctions, if they won't be like massively publicized, they'll be very subtle. But for sure, you see this kind of complicated relationship. The UN, Serbia has condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but at the same time, they will not impose sanctions. I think that we're going to see that from a lot of countries that are in the kind of under the non-aligned umbrella, condemning at the UN, but then at the same time saying, no, we have our own independent economic policy.
Yeah. I think that's very similar to like the mentality you see across much of the global South, particularly any countries who in recent memory have been the targets of Western imperialism in any way. Definitely, it's almost like it's not so much pro-Russia as like for the Putin-phile types. Mm-hmm. It's more like they see him as like a figure who stands up to the West. Right. And anybody who stands up and gives the middle finger to the West is like, yay, like I'll cheer for that person. It's that sort of mentality.
Exactly.
And then of course there's the issue of like a lot of countries have actual economic relationships and trade partnerships that they rely on for like survival with a country like Russia that produces raw commodities that are necessary to like live, which the Western countries, you can tell by their leaders, just don't care when they're telling Africa, like, why are you buying fertilizer from or grain from Russia? It's like, where else are we supposed to get it from? Right. But can you elaborate a bit on the issue of what exactly NATO did to, I'll say, Yugoslavia? What did NATO do to Yugoslavia? When we talk about Serbia having this, resentment towards NATO, I mean, it comes out of a lot that happened throughout the 90s. Obviously, we could do a whole episode on just that, but in summary.
Oh God, I don't know. This is like the hardest to talk about. Somehow this topic you like know the most about. Is somehow the most difficult to talk about. Like you said, we can talk about this for like hours. But I think that probably the Cliff's Notes version of it is that so in 1999, at the end of a decade of wars, multiple wars that saw the fracturing of Yugoslavia. There was a war in Kosovo between 1998 and 1999 between Serbian security forces and Albanians, who make up the majority of what was then the province of Serbia, southern province. And the NATO commenced a 78-day bombing campaign to halt what they said that this is with the express purpose to halt atrocities being committed by Albanians. And of course, hundreds of thousands of Albanians had left the province and were in neighboring countries. It was really a humanitarian catastrophe. At the same time, we know better enough than to just take the U.S. at its word that it has this great like human rights agenda. Of course, the other part of it, and Samantha Power would later kind of admit this, that there was also an element of NATO credibility. That year was the 50th anniversary of the founding of NATO, 1999. So this kind of gave NATO a new reason for existence. This idea that there was a new kind of like moral crusade for violence, morally acceptable violence. And the doctrine of responsibility to protect and humanitarian intervention is kind of birthed here in 1989. No, but coming back to the original question, so the 78-day bombing campaign ended with a peace agreement. Serbian forces left Kosovo, and then installed were NATO troops, the KFOR and Kosovo Force, and that's multi-country program. They're still there. And actually, in the beginning, Russian troops served alongside the NATO force in 1999 and in early aughts. So yeah, it was. Serbs felt really like driven out of all the neighboring out of the other republics of the former Yugoslavia, and that that NATO. That civilians were killed, and that in some cases there were very controversial operations undertaken by NATO. For example, the targeting of Radio Television Serbia, the state television station, in which civilian journalists and makeup artists were killed. The Chinese embassy was targeted, and the only target of the entire campaign that was chosen by the CIA happened to be the Chinese embassy. They claimed it was a mistake, and everybody, even like pretty mainstream commentators, know that that's not, acknowledge that it's like very unlikely that that's the case. So this was a controversial thing, and a very, very painful one, because the civilians were killed, and the attitude of the West has always been, well, look at what you did in Kosovo leading up to this, and which is, of course, that should be discussed, and there were very horrible things happening in Kosovo, and nobody, I think, should ever deny that. But at the same time, we've come to this point where you're not really, or NATO is not subjected. The U.S. and NATO are kind of above the law. Mm-hmm. The International Criminal Tribunal, which was established and opened kind of during the war, and very explicitly, like the kind of communications person who's the kind of like spokesman of the court said, like, we will only be trying people of Yugoslav nationality. NATO will not be subject to any kind of oversight, really, or like any accountability. So I think that it's important. This is also a precedent, to have countries and who are not subject to the same kind of standards or scrutiny, legal scrutiny. And I think that's it was seen as sort of a great injustice by Serbs. And of course, there's a lot more to say, but that's the kind of Cliff's Notes version of it.
Yeah, I know, it's well done. And then, of course, you have these other countries, places like Croatia, Kosovo, Northern Macedonia, and Montenegro. Where do they fit into this current equation, and with respect to the latest war between Russia and Ukraine and the sort of NATO proxy war that's happening?
It's very interesting. The two newest members of NATO before the Scandinavians kind of got into the entered the picture this year were Montenegro and Macedonia, formerly North Macedonia. And I think I didn't expect to talk about this, but I'll just say, because I'm writing about it right now.
Okay.
This when you hear from people on talking about how this has nothing to do with NATO, the war in Ukraine, and they talk about how countries join NATO because they want to. These are some of the talking points you hear. I would ask them to revisit the process that accompanied the NATO membership in Montenegro and in Macedonia. Because this was a completely different situation than the new memberships that happened after the war in Ukraine started in 2014 were undertaken in a vastly different environment than before. And of course, maybe it's not entirely the case, because maybe there were shady things about other countries joining NATO. But I can tell you that I was there in North Macedonia, and I covered this region. I have for many years. So there was a referendum on the changing of the country's name. Macedonia's previously, North Macedonia was Macedonia, but Greece lays claim to the name Macedonia and to the culture and the history. And so this was a huge sticking point for Greece, and they would have been therefore blocking accession of Macedonia to NATO for many years, for decades. And so so there was a referendum. And the text of the referendum was something like, do you support, I'm not going to try to reproduce the actual text of it, but basically, do you support changing the name of the country for Euro-Atlantic membership, to Euro-Atlantic institutions, which means basically NATO, right? Yeah. Euro-Atlantic. So it was boycotted, mass boycotted overwhelmingly. I think they felt like double-digit percentage points lower than required by the Constitution to become viable, to be a legal result. During that day, I remember people were calling me, this is a crisis, this is like, wow, what are we going to do? And then it was, at the end of the day, it was spun as, okay, the referendum was just consultative. This is actually a victory, because of the whatever 20, 30% of people who put up, like 90% of them supported it. Of course, this is a very kind of small, liberal NGO kind of the very vehemently kind of pro-Western, very, very kind of like pro-EU crowd that tends to be kind of more higher earners, have more links with the West. They were overwhelmingly for it. So it was spun, this mass boycott was spun as a victory. And it was even according to their own constitution, it was not valid. It was not a valid result. They joined NATO.
Yeah.
Like, Montenegro didn't have a referendum, and even by the polls, they didn't have a majority of support. So these were not democratic processes by any measure. And so when I hear people say, countries join NATO because they want to. Okay, like maybe that is true in Latvia and in Poland. Like, I'm sure that there is truth. Like, that's true. I mean, I have to admit that is true. Not so in the Balkans. It's a whole different experience of recent history, and a whole entirely different. These are different countries, different cultures, with different attitudes.
That's really interesting. I look forward to seeing that piece. I guess, that's pretty much everything I wanted to discuss with you today. But Lily, can you tell people where they can find your work? I know that you write quite often for New Left Review. You're quite active on Twitter. Where else can people find you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. I have a Patreon. I don't know if people are interested in that kind of thing. I do write about this stuff. I write about NATO enlargement. I write about Balkan politics. I have also kind of mostly Eastern Europe and Ukraine. I was in Ukraine in Odessa in 2014, actually. So I do, and I write about all kinds of stuff. So I'm on Patreon.
And you actually speak these languages. But sorry, I didn't mean to. What's your Patreon? Shout that out.
Lily Lynch. So yeah, and I write sometimes about Scandinavia. I know it less, but I had a Swedish husband, so I kind of speak.
Okay. Well, very cool. Cool. That was useful.
Right, unexpectedly so.
On that note, but thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we can do this again soon and cover one of the many other topics that you have so much expertise on.
Thank you so much, Rania. You're so sweet.
Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to see more progressive anti-imperialist content like this, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date with the latest breakthrough news content. And if you want to support our work and get access to exclusive content, head over to patreon.com/breakthroughnews.